It's a bitter January evening in 2024, and the lights are going out at Royal Lodge. Not literally, not yet. But in the fading winter light, something fundamental is ending. Through the tall Georgian windows of this 30-room mansion, you can see movement. Boxes, packing tape, the careful, humiliating work of dismantling a life that was supposed to last forever. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, once the Queen's favorite son, is leaving. He doesn't want to go. He's fought this for 2 years, privately, desperately, sometimes publicly. He's invoked his lease, his investments, his rights. He's pointed to the millions he spent renovating this place, to the promises made, to the decades he was supposed to have here. He's dug in his heels with the stubbornness of a man who believes, who needs to believe, that he still has power, that he still matters, that the old rules still apply to him. But the old rules don't apply anymore. Outside the gates of Royal Lodge, where the long tree-lined drive curves through Windsor Great Park, there's no crowd. No protesters today, though there have been plenty in the past 2 years. No cameras, though they've been here too, documenting every humiliation. Just the quiet, cold reality of a prince packing up his palace. This is the story of how a house became a prison, how a symbol of royal comfort transformed into a symbol of royal shame. How one of the most beautiful homes in Britain, a place that once embodied family, tradition, and continuity, became instead a warning about privilege, accountability, and what happens when you refuse to read the room. This is the story of Royal Lodge, and it's darker than you think. If you're fascinated by the hidden histories of grand estates, the real power structures behind royal walls, and the human cost of living in palaces, you're in the right place. This channel digs deep into the stories that shaped these houses and the people who lived, and sometimes suffered, inside them. If that sounds like your kind of content, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me which royal or aristocratic estate I should investigate next. Your support makes these deep dives possible. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Royal Lodge wasn't always a prince's refuge or a scandal's epicenter. Its story begins much more modestly. In the 1660s, when it was nothing more than a keeper's lodge, a small, practical building in Windsor Great Park where the deputy ranger lived while managing the royal estate's deer and woodlands. For over a century, it remained exactly that, functional, forgettable, a working building for working staff. It wasn't meant to be seen. It wasn't meant to matter. But in the 1820s, everything changed. King George IV, extravagant, emotional, obsessed with beauty and grandeur, decided Windsor Great Park needed a transformation. He commissioned the renowned architect Jeffrey Epstein, the same man reshaping Windsor Castle itself, to reimagine Royal Lodge as something far more ambitious, a private royal retreat, not a state residence, not a place for ceremony or politics, a home. Wyatville expanded the building dramatically, adding new wings, grand reception rooms, and a sweeping classical facade. He surrounded it with landscape gardens, ornamental ponds, and carefully curated views across the park. The interiors were filled with rich fabrics, fine furniture, and the kind of comfortable elegance that only truly wealthy people can afford to make look effortless. George IV loved it. He used it as his personal escape, a place to retreat from the pressures and performances of court life, to entertain close friends, to live as something closer to a private gentleman than a king. It was, in many ways, the first version of what Royal Lodge would become known for as sanctuary. But George IV's reign was short. He died in 1830, and Royal Lodge, like so many royal properties, fell into uncertainty. His successors didn't share his passion for the place. King William IV barely used it. Queen Victoria focused on Balmoral and Osborne, largely ignored it. For decades, Royal Lodge drifted. It was maintained, but not loved. Occupied occasionally, but not claimed. It became one of those royal properties that existed in a strange limbo, too grand to abandon, too personal to repurpose, waiting for someone to need it again. That someone eventually was King George VI. In 1931, Prince Albert, who would later become King George VI, and his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, were looking for a family home. Albert was the second son, not expected to be king. He wanted somewhere comfortable, private, away from the formality of Buckingham Palace. Somewhere his two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, could have a childhood. They found Royal Lodge. It wasn't in great shape. The building had been neglected for years, and parts of it were deteriorating. But Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, saw its potential. She loved the gardens, the space, the privacy, the light. She convinced Albert they could make it work. They signed a lease from the Crown Estate and moved in. And for the next 20 years, Royal Lodge became something rare in royal life, a genuine family home. Elizabeth and Margaret grew up there. They played in the gardens, helped with the flower beds, had birthday parties under the trees. George VI, shy and burdened by his unexpected kingship after his brother Edward VIII's abdication, found peace there. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon poured herself into the house and grounds, transforming them with a gardener's passion and an aristocrat's eye for beauty. Even after George VI's death in 1952, the Queen Mother, as Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was now known, stayed. Royal Lodge was hers. She lived there for another 50 years, hosting family gatherings, tending her beloved gardens, filling the rooms with friends, laughter, art, and the particular kind of warm, cluttered elegance she was famous for. By the time she died in 2002, Royal Lodge had become something sacred in the royal family's collective memory. It wasn't just a house. It was continuity. It was childhood. It was the last place where being royal had felt, for a moment, almost normal. And that was the house Prince Andrew inherited. When the Queen Mother died in March 2002, Royal Lodge was empty for the first time in 70 years. The question immediately arose: what happens to it now? The Crown Estate technically owned the property, as it does with most royal residences. But within the family, there was a clear sense that whoever took it on needed to respect its history, maintain its standards, and treat it as more than just a perk. Prince Andrew wanted it. At the time, this seemed almost reasonable. Andrew was still a working royal, carrying out hundreds of official engagements a year as the UK's special representative for international trade and investment. He had two young daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, who needed stability after his divorce from Sarah Ferguson. He'd been living in Sunninghill Park, a much less prestigious property, and Royal Lodge represented a significant upgrade, not just in size and status, but in meaning. In 2003, Andrew signed a 75-year lease with the Crown Estate. The terms seemed generous, just £250 per week in rent, a symbolic amount. But there was a catch, a significant one. Andrew was required to fund all renovations and ongoing maintenance himself. And Royal Lodge needed a lot of work. The house had been lived in continuously by an elderly woman for 50 years. Much of it was charming but outdated. The plumbing, heating, and electrical systems were ancient. The roof needed repairs. The exterior paintwork was flaking. The interior decor, however beloved by the Queen Mother, was firmly stuck in the mid-20th century. The Crown Estate surveyors estimated that bringing Royal Lodge up to modern standards and maintaining it properly would cost millions up front, and at least £250,000 per year in ongoing maintenance. Andrew agreed. He had the money at the time. He'd received a substantial settlement when Sunninghill Park was sold, controversially, to a Kazakh oligarch for well above market value. But that's another layer to this story. He had his Navy pension. He had some income from royal duties. Between 2004 and 2008, Andrew spent approximately £7.5 million renovating Royal Lodge. He restored the exterior, upgraded the interiors, modernized the infrastructure, and maintained the gardens to Crown Estate standards. It was a genuine investment, and by all accounts, he did it properly. He moved in with Sarah Ferguson, who, despite their divorce, had remained close, and their daughters. For a few years, it worked. Royal Lodge became, once again, a family home. Andrew hosted events there, entertained foreign dignitaries as part of his trade role, and seemed to settle into the role of custodian. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming, and they had a name: Jeffrey Epstein. The first reports of a friendship between Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein surfaced in the early 2000s, but they didn't gain significant traction immediately. Epstein was known in elite circles as a wealthy financier with connections to politicians, scientists, academics, and celebrities. He had homes in Manhattan, Palm Beach, New Mexico, Paris, and a private island in the Caribbean. He threw lavish parties. He funded scientific research. He seemed, to those who didn't look too closely, like just another very rich man with eclectic interests. Andrew met him through Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite and daughter of disgraced media mogul Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine and Andrew had known each other for years. She moved in royal circles, understood that world, knew how to navigate it. She introduced Epstein to Andrew sometime in the late 1990s, and they became friends. What did that friendship look like? Andrew stayed at Epstein's homes. He flew on Epstein's private jet. He was photographed at Epstein's parties, surrounded by young women. Epstein visited Royal Lodge and Windsor Castle. He was, for a period, part of Andrew's inner circle. At the time, this didn't seem particularly unusual, at least not publicly. Rich, powerful men socializing with other rich, powerful men. Standard practice in Andrew's world. But in 2008, everything changed. Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in Florida and charged with soliciting prostitution from a minor. The case revealed a pattern of abuse. Epstein had been sexually exploiting underage girls for years, using his wealth, homes, and network to facilitate and conceal his crimes. The details were disturbing. The scale was shocking. Epstein pleaded guilty in 2008 to state charges in a controversial deal that allowed him to serve just 13 months in a county jail with work release privileges, a sentence widely criticized as far too lenient given the severity of his crimes. He was registered as a sex offender. For most people, that would have been the end of the friendship. You don't stay close to a convicted sex offender, especially not if you're a British prince whose role is supposed to embody dignity, morality, and public service. Andrew didn't end the friendship. He continued to see Epstein. In 2010, 2 years after Epstein's conviction, Andrew was photographed in New York City, walking with Epstein in Central Park, staying at Epstein's Manhattan mansion. The photos were published in British tabloids. The headlines were brutal: Prince and the Pervert, Andrew's terrible error of judgment. The palace issued statements. Andrew expressed regret for the friendship, called it a mistake, said he'd gone to New York to end the relationship in person. But the damage was done. The public saw a prince who either didn't understand or didn't care about the optics of associating with a predator. And still, it got worse. In 2015, court documents from a U.S. civil case were unsealed. They included allegations from Virginia Roberts Giuffre, one of Epstein's victims, who claimed she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced to have sex with several powerful men, including Prince Andrew. She alleged this happened 3 times, in London, New York, and on Epstein's private island, when she was 17 years old. Andrew categorically denied the allegations. The palace issued firm statements. The claims were false. Andrew had never met Giuffre. The accusations were baseless. But Giuffre provided details, dates, locations, even a photograph showing her standing with Andrew, his arm around her waist, at Ghislaine Maxwell's London home. The photograph was damning. Not legally, it didn't prove the allegations, but in the court of public opinion, it was devastating. For several years, Andrew continued with his royal duties, but the shadow of Epstein followed him. Charities began distancing themselves from him. Events became awkward. Journalists started asking harder questions. And then in August 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again, this time on federal charges of sex trafficking minors. He was held without bail in a Manhattan jail. 1 month later, on August 10, 2019, Epstein was found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. The circumstances fueled conspiracy theories, but the immediate effect was clear. The case exploded. The media coverage intensified. The scrutiny of everyone connected to Epstein, including Prince Andrew, became relentless. Andrew made a decision. He would address the allegations directly, sit for a television interview, and clear his name. On November 16, 2019, the BBC aired a special edition of Newsnight featuring a 49-minute interview between Prince Andrew and journalist Emily Maitlis, recorded at Buckingham Palace. It was supposed to be Andrew's opportunity to explain, to show remorse for his friendship with Epstein, to express empathy for Epstein's victims, and to address the allegations with clarity and dignity. It was a catastrophe. From the opening moments, Andrew's tone was wrong. He showed no empathy for Epstein's victims. He repeatedly defended his friendship with Epstein, calling it useful for his work and convenient because of Epstein's connections. He claimed he didn't regret the friendship because it had seriously beneficial outcomes for him. When asked about the allegations from Virginia Giuffre, Andrew offered a series of explanations that ranged from implausible to bizarre. He claimed he couldn't have been at the London nightclub where Giuffre said they met because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter Beatrice that day, a detail so oddly specific it became instant tabloid fodder. He said he couldn't have been sweating during the encounter, as Giuffre described, because he had a medical condition at the time that prevented him from sweating, a condition he claimed was caused by being shot at during the Falklands War, and which had since resolved itself. He said he had no recollection of ever meeting Virginia Giuffre, despite the photograph showing them together. Throughout the interview, Andrew appeared defensive, detached, and tone-deaf. He showed no understanding of why his continued association with Epstein after the 2008 conviction was a problem. He offered no apology. He expressed no compassion. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. The interview was described as a car crash, a disaster, the worst royal interview ever. Social media lit up with mockery and outrage. Memes about Pizza Express and the inability to sweat went viral. Legal experts, PR professionals, and former royal aides went on record saying it was one of the most damaging public appearances by a royal family member in modern history. Within days, the consequences began. Charities and organizations Andrew was associated with started cutting ties. Universities, businesses, and regiments distanced themselves. Sponsors pulled out of events. The pressure on Buckingham Palace became unbearable. For days after the interview aired on November 20th, 2019, Prince Andrew released a statement announcing he was stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future. It was an unprecedented move. A senior working royal, the Queen's second son, effectively forced into retirement because of a scandal. And suddenly, the question of Royal Lodge became urgent. Before the Newsnight interview, Andrew had income streams that made Royal Lodge financially viable, if not exactly comfortable. He received approximately £250,000 per year from the Queen's private funds, essentially an allowance to support his official duties and lifestyle as a working royal. He had his Navy pension from his years of military service. He had some personal investments and the remaining proceeds from the controversial sale of Sunninghill Park. But when Andrew stepped back from royal duties, he lost the £250,000 annual allowance tied to those duties. Suddenly, the economics of Royal Lodge became impossible. The Crown Estate lease required Andrew to spend at least £250,000 per year on maintenance, repainting, roof repairs, grounds upkeep, heating, staff, security upgrades, everything required to keep a 30-room mansion in pristine condition according to royal standards. Without the allowance, Andrew was being asked to fund £250,000 in annual costs from his pension and dwindling personal savings. He couldn't do it, but he also couldn't or wouldn't leave. Royal Lodge had become more than a house to Andrew. It was his last symbol of status, his proof that he still mattered, his argument that he was still a significant member of the royal family. It was the home his daughters had grown up in, the place he'd invested millions of pounds and years of his life. Leaving would mean admitting defeat. It would mean accepting that his reputation, his role, and his place in the family had fundamentally changed. So he stayed, and the house became a battleground. In the months following his disastrous Newsnight interview and his forced retirement from royal duties, Prince Andrew retreated, physically and psychologically, into Royal Lodge. From the outside, it looked like a fortress. The 30-room mansion sat behind gates, down a long private drive, surrounded by 98 acres of Windsor Great Park. Security remained in place, funded partly by taxpayers through Metropolitan Police protection for senior royals, though even that would later become controversial. Inside those walls, Andrew tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He still had Sarah Ferguson living with him. Their arrangement, though unconventional, had proven remarkably durable over the decades since their divorce. He still saw his daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, who remained loyal and supportive despite the scandal. He still hosted occasional private guests. But the world outside had moved on, and it was not moving in his favor. In 2020 and 2021, Virginia Giuffre's legal team continued to pursue their case. They sought testimony from Andrew, requested documents, and kept the allegations in the public eye. Andrew's legal team fought back, arguing about jurisdiction, technicalities, and the validity of claims. But every court filing, every legal maneuver, generated fresh headlines and reminded the public of the scandal. Then, in August 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit in New York against Prince Andrew, formally accusing him of sexual assault and seeking unspecified damages. Andrew's legal position was that the case should be dismissed, that Giuffre had signed a settlement agreement with Jeffrey Epstein in 2009 that released Epstein and other potential defendants from future claims, and that this agreement covered him. The court disagreed. In January 2022, a U.S. judge ruled that the case could proceed to trial. For Andrew, this was a nightmare scenario. A trial would mean testimony, cross-examination, media coverage, and the very real possibility of a jury finding against him in a civil case, which, while not a criminal conviction, would be devastating to what remained of his reputation. In February 2022, Andrew settled the case. The terms were confidential, but reports suggested he paid a sum in the region of £12 million to Giuffre and her charity supporting victims' rights. The settlement included no admission of liability, but it also included a statement in which Andrew acknowledged that Giuffre had been a victim of abuse by Epstein and expressed regret for his association with Epstein. The payment was reportedly funded partly by the Queen, who was said to have contributed to help her son avoid the humiliation of a trial. But the settlement didn't restore Andrew's reputation. If anything, it confirmed the public's worst suspicions, that he was desperate to avoid testifying, that he had something to hide, that his denials rang hollow. And it created a new problem. Andrew was now even more financially strained. Between legal fees and the settlement, millions had disappeared. The economics of maintaining Royal Lodge were becoming not just difficult, but impossible. And then in September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died. When Elizabeth II passed away at Balmoral on September 8, 2022, the British monarchy entered a new era. Her eldest son became King Charles III, and with that transition came a new approach to royal finances, public accountability, and the management of the family's image. Charles had spent decades waiting to be king, and he developed clear ideas about what the monarchy should look like in the 21st century. He believed in a slimmed-down institution, fewer working royals, tighter control over public funds, a focus on the core line of succession. He believed in transparency and public accountability, understanding that the days of unquestioned deference to royalty were long over. And he had no patience for scandal. Andrew had already been a problem for years, an embarrassment Charles had quietly resented. But while the Queen was alive, there was a limit to what Charles could do. Elizabeth had a soft spot for Andrew. He was, by many accounts, her favorite child, and she'd been protective of him even as his reputation collapsed. She'd funded his legal defense. She'd allowed him to keep Royal Lodge. She'd shielded him from the full consequences of his actions. Charles felt no such obligation. Within months of becoming king, Charles made his move. He formally cut off the annual allowance the Queen had been providing to Andrew, reportedly around £250,000 per year, which had been coming from her private Duchy of Lancaster income even after Andrew stopped receiving the official allowance tied to royal duties. Without that money, Andrew had no realistic way to meet his obligations under the Royal Lodge lease. The Crown Estate made its position clear. If Andrew couldn't afford the required annual maintenance costs and couldn't keep the property up to the standards outlined in his lease agreement, he would be in breach of the lease terms. And breaches could lead to eviction. Charles also made another decision. He offered Andrew an alternative. Frogmore Cottage. Frogmore Cottage is a much smaller royal residence, also in Windsor, also on Crown Estate land. It had recently been vacated by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle after their move to California. It's a beautiful property, historic, well-maintained, comfortable. But it's a 5-bedroom home, not a 30-room mansion. It's a cottage, not a palace. For Andrew, the offer was humiliating. Moving from Royal Lodge to Frogmore Cottage would be a visible public demotion. It would be an admission that he no longer held significant status within the family. It would be the final, undeniable proof that he'd fallen. He refused. While Andrew fought privately to keep Royal Lodge, the public was losing patience. The British press, never gentle with royal scandals, had been covering Andrew's situation relentlessly. But now the coverage took on a sharper edge. It wasn't just about scandal anymore, it was about money. Taxpayers were still funding Andrew's security, which cost an estimated £3 million per year. Taxpayers had funded the initial renovations of Royal Lodge back in the early 2000s through indirect subsidies to the Crown Estate. Taxpayers had, in a sense, funded the Queen's financial support to Andrew over the years, since her income derived partly from public lands managed through the Duchy of Lancaster. And now Andrew, unemployed, disgraced, and effectively retired from public life, was refusing to downsize from a £30 million mansion he could no longer afford, while ordinary Britons struggled with a cost of living crisis. The headlines wrote themselves: Prince Andrew clings to palace while Britons suffer. Disgraced royal refuses to leave taxpayer-funded mansion. Andrew's stubborn extravagance in an age of austerity. Public opinion, already overwhelmingly negative toward Andrew, hardened further. Polls showed that the vast majority of Britons believed Andrew should leave Royal Lodge, that his security costs should be cut, and that he should face greater consequences for his actions. Protests began appearing outside the gates of Windsor properties. Small groups mostly, but vocal, holding signs demanding Andrew's eviction, chanting about privilege and accountability, calling for an end to what they saw as royal hypocrisy. Royal Lodge, once a symbol of family and continuity, had become a symbol of everything people hated about the monarchy: entitlement, immunity, and the sense that rules didn't apply to those born into wealth and power. Inside the gates, Andrew remained defiant. He pointed to his lease, a legally binding 75-year agreement. He pointed to the millions he'd personally spent on renovations. He argued that he had every right to stay, that the property was his home, and that he was being unfairly persecuted. But legal rights and public opinion are not the same thing. And King Charles understood that the cost of allowing Andrew to stay, in terms of public trust and the monarchy's reputation, was far too high. The pressure continued to build. By early 2023, the standoff had become unsustainable. Andrew remained at Royal Lodge, insisting on his legal rights and his long-term lease. King Charles had cut his financial support, making it nearly impossible for Andrew to meet his maintenance obligations. The Crown Estate, caught between the royal family and their legal agreements, was growing increasingly frustrated. And then the inspections began. The Crown Estate, as the landlord, had the right under the lease agreement to conduct periodic inspections to ensure the property was being maintained to the required standards. In late 2022 and early 2023, surveyors visited Royal Lodge and assessed its condition. What they found gave the Crown Estate legal grounds to act. The reports indicated that certain required maintenance had not been completed. Exterior paintwork, which needed regular attention given the building's age and the British climate, was deteriorating in places. Some roof repairs, identified in earlier surveys as necessary within specific timeframes, had been delayed or left incomplete. Grounds maintenance, which required professional landscaping to preserve the formal gardens and park surroundings, was not meeting the lease standards. None of this meant the house was falling apart. Royal Lodge was still a beautiful, functional residence. But the lease was explicit. Andrew was required to maintain the property to good repair and condition, as defined by the Crown Estate standards, and he was required to fund and complete specific works on a schedule. He had not done so. Not fully. Not consistently. The reason was obvious. He didn't have the money. But from the Crown Estate's perspective, The reason didn't matter. The lease terms were clear, and Andrew was in breach. In spring 2023, the Crown Estate sent Andrew formal notice of the deficiencies and gave him a deadline to complete the required works. Andrew's legal team responded, arguing that the deficiencies were minor, that he was making good faith efforts to maintain the property, and that eviction over these issues would be disproportionate and unfair given his decades-long lease and substantial prior investment. But the Crown Estate's position was equally firm. Andrew had signed an agreement. The agreement had conditions, and he was not meeting them. If he could not afford to maintain Royal Lodge to the required standard, he needed to leave. Behind the scenes, King Charles was applying his own pressure. He made it clear to Andrew, through family intermediaries, that this situation needed to end. The monarchy couldn't afford the ongoing scandal. The public couldn't tolerate the appearance of Andrew living in luxury while refusing accountability. The family needed to move forward, and Andrew needed to accept reality. Charles reportedly offered Andrew a face-saving compromise, voluntary departure from Royal Lodge, a move to Frogmore Cottage with dignity and privacy, and continued financial support for security and basic living expenses, if Andrew agreed to cooperate. But if Andrew continued to refuse, Charles was prepared to let the Crown Estate proceed with formal eviction proceedings. For Andrew, the choice was impossible. Moving voluntarily felt like surrender. But fighting an eviction battle in court against the Crown Estate, with King Charles's implicit backing, would be even more humiliating, more public, and almost certainly doomed to fail. He was trapped. Through the summer and fall of 2023, negotiations continued. Andrew's legal and financial advisors worked desperately to find a solution, perhaps a renegotiated lease, perhaps a financial arrangement that would allow him to stay, perhaps a compromise on the maintenance requirements. Nothing worked. The Crown Estate held firm. The required maintenance had to be completed, and it had to be funded by Andrew, as the lease stipulated. If he couldn't do that, he had to leave. In December 2023, the final notice came. Andrew was formally required to vacate Royal Lodge by January 2024. The notice gave him a specific deadline and outlined the legal consequences of refusing. The Crown Estate would begin eviction proceedings, his lease would be terminated, and he would be removed from the property. The deadline was not arbitrary. January held symbolic weight, a fresh start for a new year, a clean break from the past, and a clear message that the new reign under King Charles III would not tolerate the dysfunction that had defined Andrew's final years as a working royal. For Andrew, it must have felt like the world closing in. Royal Lodge wasn't just a house. It was the place he'd chosen after his divorce, the place he'd invested millions trying to make permanent, the place his daughters had grown up. It was his sanctuary during the Epstein scandal, his refuge after Newsnight, his last symbol of status and significance. Leaving meant admitting he'd lost everything. But he had no choice. The images that emerged in early January 2024 told the story more powerfully than any statement or press release could. Removal vans parked outside Royal Lodge, boxes being loaded, furniture wrapped in protective covers, staff moving carefully through the rooms, dismantling the life Andrew had built there over 2 decades. There was no grand ceremony, no official announcement, no carefully staged photo opportunity, just the quiet, humiliating logistics of moving out. Sarah Ferguson, who'd lived at Royal Lodge with Andrew throughout the scandal, supervised much of the packing. Their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, visited to help and offer support. It was, by all accounts, an intensely emotional process for the family, not just because of the logistics, but because of what the move symbolized. This was the final undeniable proof that Andrew's fall was complete. He was leaving a 30-room mansion, a sprawling estate, a property steeped in royal history and family memory, and moving into a 5-bedroom cottage. He was leaving behind the illusion that he was still a significant royal, still powerful, still untouchable. He was being forced, publicly, to accept a diminished reality. The British press covered the move extensively, though with a notable shift in tone. There was less mockery now, less tabloid glee. Instead, there was a kind of grim satisfaction, a sense that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Andrew had clung to privilege for years after his actions should have disqualified him from it. He'd avoided accountability, relied on family protection, and refused to accept the consequences of his choices. But now, at last, he was being held to account. Not through the criminal justice system, which had never charged him. Not through the civil courts, where he'd settled his case. But through the one institution he couldn't fight, the monarchy itself, under a king who had decided enough was enough. On a cold January day in 2024, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson left Royal Lodge for the last time and moved into Frogmore Cottage. The gates closed behind them. Royal Lodge sits empty now, or at least it's no longer a home. The Crown Estate has taken back full control of the property, and the question facing them is the same question that's faced royal estates for centuries. What do you do with a house this grand, this expensive, this symbolically loaded? Several options are being discussed. One possibility is leasing it to another member of the royal family. Prince William and Catherine have been mentioned, though they seem content at Adelaide Cottage and unlikely to want the burden of such a large property. Other working royals might be considered, but the pool of senior royals is small, and Royal Lodge comes with a difficult legacy now. Anyone who moves in will be stepping into Andrew's shadow. Another option is opening Royal Lodge to the public, at least partially. Windsor Great Park is already a popular destination, and adding Royal Lodge as a historic house museum, emphasizing its connections to the Queen Mother and King George VI, rather than to Andrew, could generate revenue and serve a public educational purpose. But that option has complications. Royal Lodge is still relatively close to Windsor Castle, and security concerns around active royal residences make full public access difficult. The house would also need significant preparation, curation, and staffing to function as a museum. A third possibility is using Royal Lodge for official purposes, perhaps as a residence for visiting dignitaries or for hosting state-related events and receptions, essentially turning it into a functional wing of the Crown Estate's hospitality operations. Or it could simply remain empty for a while, carefully maintained by the Crown Estate, waiting for a purpose that makes sense politically, financially, and symbolically. What's certain is that Royal Lodge will never again be what it was under the Queen Mother, a beloved family home, a place of warmth and continuity, a symbol of royal life at its most human and relatable. Andrew's tenure there has tainted that memory, perhaps irreparably. So what does Royal Lodge actually represent now, after everything that's happened? It's tempting to see it as simply a house, a very grand, very expensive house, but still just a building, bricks and mortar and history. But that's not how royal properties work. They've never been just houses. They're symbols. They're stages. They're physical manifestations of power, status, and the stories we tell about monarchy. Royal Lodge, under the Queen Mother, symbolized continuity and comfort. It was the place where a shy king found peace, where two princesses grew up with some semblance of normalcy, where a beloved matriarch spent her final decades surrounded by beauty and memory. It represented the best version of royal life, dignified, but not cold, grand, but not inaccessible, traditional, but not stuffy. That symbolism mattered. It was part of why the public loved the Queen Mother, and part of why the royal family treasured the place. But under Prince Andrew, Royal Lodge came to symbolize something entirely different: entitlement, denial, and the failure of privilege to protect itself from accountability. Andrew treated Royal Lodge as his right, his reward, his castle. He seems to have genuinely believed that because he'd signed a lease, because he'd invested money, because he was a prince, the house was his to keep regardless of his behavior or his public standing. He was wrong. What the Royal Lodge saga demonstrates, painfully publicly, is that the old rules are changing. Being born royal no longer guarantees a lifetime of comfort and protection. Association with criminals, even if no criminal charges result, carries consequences. Public opinion matters, and monarchies that ignore public opinion do so at their peril. King Charles understood this. That's why he acted, even though it meant forcing his own brother out of a family home. The monarchy's survival depends on its ability to adapt, to demonstrate accountability, to show that it understands modern values around justice, equality, and responsibility. allowing Andrew to remain at Royal Lodge, clinging to a mansion he couldn't afford while the public watched in disgust, would have undermined everything Charles is trying to build. So Royal Lodge became a battleground, and then a symbol of something new, a monarchy willing to discipline its own. To fully understand the significance of what happened at Royal Lodge, you need to step back and look at the bigger picture of how royal privilege operates and how it's breaking down. For centuries, being born into royalty meant something close to immunity. Kings and princes were above the law, or at least functionally above it. They could behave badly, live extravagantly, make terrible decisions, and the consequences were minimal. There were exceptions, of course: executions, revolutions, scandals that brought down entire dynasties. But those were extreme cases. Day to day, royalty came with extraordinary protection. That protection had several layers. First, legal immunity. In Britain, the monarch still technically cannot be prosecuted. The legal system operates in the sovereign's name, so prosecuting the sovereign is a logical impossibility. Members of the royal family have historically enjoyed similar protections, either formal or informal. Second, financial insulation. Royals had access to enormous inherited wealth, state funding, and property held in trust by institutions like the Crown Estate. They didn't have to earn money, budget carefully, or face the economic consequences of their choices the way ordinary people do. Third, social and media deference. For most of modern history, the press treated royalty with a level of respect that bordered on reverence. Scandals were downplayed, indiscretions ignored, and the institution itself was rarely questioned seriously. But all three of those protections have been eroding for decades. Legal immunity has narrowed. While the monarch remains protected, other royals are not above the law. They can be sued, investigated, and held accountable in civil courts, as Andrew discovered. Financial insulation has weakened. The royal family's funding is now subject to public scrutiny, parliamentary oversight, and constant pressure to justify expenditures. The days of unlimited state support are over, and media deference? Completely gone. The British tabloids have been vicious toward royals for years, but even mainstream outlets now cover the family with a critical eye, asking hard questions about cost, relevance, and behavior. All of this means that being a prince in 2024 is nothing like being a prince in 1954 or even 1984. The protections are thinner. The expectations are higher. The consequences for failure are real. Andrew seems not to have understood this. Or perhaps he understood it intellectually but couldn't emotionally accept it. He genuinely appears to have believed that his royal status, his decades of service, his personal investment in Royal Lodge, and his mother's protection would be enough to shield him from the fallout of his association with Epstein. He was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. There's another dimension to this story that's often overlooked in the focus on scandal and privilege: the human cost to Andrew's family, particularly his daughters. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie were children when their parents divorced. They were teenagers when their father became friends with Jeffrey Epstein. They were young adults when the scandal broke, and they spent their entire adult lives navigating the impossible position of loving a father whose public reputation is in ruins. Both daughters have remained loyal to Andrew throughout the scandal. They've been photographed with him, they've supported him privately, and they've made clear in interviews and through their actions that their relationship with their father is separate from public judgment of him. This loyalty is, in many ways, admirable. Children shouldn't have to abandon their parents because of public scandal, and the idea that Beatrice and Eugenie should disown their father to appease public opinion is deeply uncomfortable. But it's also complicated their own lives significantly. Both women have had to carefully manage their own public images, balancing their royal heritage with their desire for relatively private lives and careers. Both have married and started families. Both have tried to build identities separate from the scandal. But they can't escape it. Every profile, every interview, every public appearance includes some reference to their father and the Epstein case. Royal Lodge, in this context, represented something important to them: stability. It was the home they'd grown up in, the place where family gathered, the physical space that connected them to their childhood and to the idea of family continuity. Watching their father be forced to leave that home, however justified from a public accountability standpoint, must have been heartbreaking. And yet, there are no reports of Beatrice or Eugenie publicly defending Andrew's right to stay at Royal Lodge. They helped him move. They supported him emotionally. But they didn't fight the decision. Perhaps they, unlike their father, understood that the battle was unwinnable. Or perhaps they recognized that clinging to Royal Lodge was only prolonging the pain and the public humiliation. Either way, their quiet loyalty, combined with their apparent acceptance of the outcome, adds another layer of tragedy to the story. And then there's Sarah Ferguson. Andrew's ex-wife has been one of the most unusual figures in this entire saga. Despite divorcing Andrew in 1996 after a scandal involving compromising photos and serious financial troubles, Sarah never really left. She's lived with Andrew on and off for most of the past 3 decades. She was living with him at Royal Lodge throughout the Epstein scandal, the Newsnight interview, the lawsuit, and the eviction. Their relationship has baffled observers for years. They both said publicly that they remain the happiest divorced couple in the world, that they're best friends, that they co-parent beautifully, and that they simply work better as companions than as a married couple. Cynics have suggested financial motivations. Sarah has had serious money troubles over the years, and living with Andrew provided stability. Others have suggested genuine affection and loyalty, a bond formed over years of shared experience and mutual understanding. Whatever the truth, Sarah's presence at Royal Lodge added another strange dimension to the story. She wasn't legally entitled to be there. She had no claim on the property, no lease, no formal status. She was there because Andrew allowed it, and because their unconventional arrangement worked for them. When Andrew was forced to leave, Sarah left with him. She moved to Frogmore Cottage. She remains, as far as anyone can tell, his closest companion and fiercest defender. In many ways, Sarah's loyalty mirrors the loyalty of Andrew's daughters, loving someone despite their flaws, refusing to abandon them even when the world has turned against them. But it also highlights something else: Andrew's profound isolation, outside of his immediate family, who stands with him, who defends him publicly, who argues that he's been treated unfairly. Almost no one. That isolation, more than any legal consequence, may be the truest punishment Andrew faces. One of the most striking aspects of the Royal Lodge saga is how much it mattered to people who had no direct connection to the royal family, to Windsor, or even to Britain. Why did ordinary people care so passionately about whether a disgraced prince stayed in a mansion or moved to a cottage? The answer gets at something fundamental about how we relate to monarchy, privilege, and justice in the 21st century. On the surface, the Royal Lodge story is about a property dispute, a lease, maintenance obligations, and a landlord-tenant disagreement. But symbolically, it became about much more. It became a test of whether the monarchy could hold its own members accountable. For decades, perhaps centuries, the perception has been that royals play by different rules. They live in palaces funded by taxpayers. They inherit wealth and status. They're shielded from the normal consequences of bad behavior by family loyalty, institutional protection, and legal privileges. And for a long time, the public accepted this, or at least tolerated it, because there was an implicit social contract. Royals get privilege, but in exchange, they're supposed to behave with dignity, serve the public, and embody certain values. Andrew broke that contract. His association with a convicted sex offender, his disastrous attempt to defend that association on television, and his apparent inability to understand why people were outraged. All of it violated the basic terms of the deal. And yet, for years, he seemed to face no real consequences. He lost his official duties, yes. He lost his allowances. But he was still living in a £30 million mansion. He was still being protected by taxpayer-funded security. He was still, in a very real sense, insulated by his royal status. Royal Lodge became the physical embodiment of that insulation. As long as Andrew remained there, it felt like he was getting away with it, not legally, perhaps, but socially and symbolically. So when King Charles finally forced him out, it felt like accountability. It felt like justice, even if it was just symbolic justice. It felt like the system finally working, even if it took years too long. That's why people cared. It's impossible to tell the Royal Lodge story without acknowledging the role of the British media, particularly the tabloid press. The UK tabloids, papers like The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Mirror, have a complicated relationship with the royal family. They're obsessed with royals, covering every detail of their lives with an intensity that borders on surveillance. But they're also ruthless critics, especially when a royal provides them with scandal material. Andrew provided a lot of scandal material. From the moment the Epstein connection became public, the tabloids were relentless. They published photos of Andrew with Epstein. They tracked his movements. They dug into his finances, his friendships, his past behavior. They interviewed Epstein's victims, experts on sex trafficking, legal analysts, and former royal staff. And they shaped public opinion. The tabloid coverage of Andrew was overwhelmingly negative, and it framed the narrative in ways that influenced how millions of people understood the story. Andrew wasn't just a prince who'd made a mistake. He was Andrew the arrogant, the disgraced duke, the prince, and the pervert. Some of this coverage was sensationalist, unfair, and ethically questionable. Tabloids don't operate by the same journalistic standards as broadsheets or investigative outlets. They prioritize clicks, sales, and outrage over nuance. But some of it was genuinely important journalism. The tabloids, whatever their flaws, asked questions that needed to be asked. Why was Andrew still friends with Epstein after his conviction? Why was he still living in a mansion funded indirectly by taxpayers? Why wasn't the monarchy holding him accountable? And when the palace tried to ignore the scandal or minimize it, the tabloids wouldn't let them. They kept the pressure on, kept the story alive, and forced the royal family to respond. Royal Lodge became a particular focus of tabloid attention because it was so visual, so tangible. Reporters could stand outside the gates and film the mansion. They could contrast it with images of ordinary Britain struggling with housing costs. They could interview locals who resented the idea of a disgraced prince living in luxury while they paid taxes. That constant media pressure created a feedback loop. The more the tabloids covered Royal Lodge, the more the public cared about Royal Lodge, which gave the tabloids more reason to cover it. Eventually, the pressure became too great for the palace to resist. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Andrew moved into Frogmore Cottage, because Frogmore carries its own complicated royal history, specifically its association with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Harry and Meghan renovated Frogmore Cottage in 2018 to 2019, spending approximately £2.4 million of taxpayer money on the refurbishment before moving in. They lived there briefly before stepping back from royal duties and moving to North America in 2020. The renovation costs became a major tabloid controversy. Critics argued that spending millions on a royal residence for a couple who then immediately left the UK was wasteful and insulting to taxpayers. Harry and Meghan eventually repaid the renovation costs, but the damage to their public image was done. The contrast with Andrew is striking. Harry and Meghan spent £2.4 million, faced massive public backlash, and repaid the money. Andrew spent £7.5 million, faced massive public backlash, and stayed for another 15 years, until he was finally forced out. Why the different treatment? Part of it was timing. Andrew's renovation happened earlier, before the same level of media scrutiny. Part of it was the Queen's protection. Elizabeth clearly favored Andrew and shielded him in ways she didn't shield Harry and Meghan. But part of it was also race and media bias. Meghan, as a biracial American woman who challenged royal protocols and spoke openly about her mental health and the racism she experienced, became a particular target for the British tabloids in ways that went far beyond reasonable criticism. Andrew, a white British prince accused of far more serious misconduct, received years of protection before finally facing consequences. The fact that Andrew ended up in the same cottage Harry and Meghan once occupied, forced there by a king who wants a slimmed-down monarchy, adds another layer of complexity to the story. It suggests that the monarchy's problems go deeper than any one individual. They're structural, cultural, and tied to fundamental questions about relevance, accountability, and who gets protected when things go wrong. To understand how Andrew was ultimately evicted from Royal Lodge, you need to understand the Crown Estate, one of the most unusual and powerful property organizations in the UK. The Crown Estate is a collection of lands and properties owned by the reigning monarch in right of the Crown. That's a complicated legal phrase that essentially means the properties belong to the monarchy as an institution, not to the individual monarch personally. The Crown Estate includes an astonishing portfolio. Massive amounts of farmland, forests, coastline, and urban real estate, including significant parts of central London. It also includes Windsor Great Park and therefore Royal Lodge. Here's the strange part. The monarch doesn't control the Crown Estate. It's managed by an independent organization overseen by Parliament, and its profits go to the UK Treasury. In exchange, the monarch receives the sovereign grant, a percentage of Crown Estate profits that funds official royal duties. So when Andrew signed his lease for Royal Lodge, he wasn't signing it with his mother or with his brother. He was signing it with an independent organization that operates on commercial principles and answers, ultimately, to Parliament and public accountability standards. That structure is what allowed Andrew to be evicted. If Royal Lodge had been privately owned by the Queen, she could have let Andrew stay indefinitely, regardless of public opinion or maintenance standards. But because it's owned by the Crown Estate, the organization had legal obligations, fiduciary duties, and public scrutiny to consider. When Andrew failed to meet his lease obligations, the Crown Estate had grounds to act. And because the organization operates independently, even the king couldn't simply override the decision to protect his brother. This is actually one of the success stories of the constitutional monarchy model. Power is diffused and limited in ways that prevent pure personal favoritism. But it also highlights something uncomfortable. Andrew's eviction was possible not because the monarchy chose accountability, but because the monarchy's property was taken out of its direct control centuries ago. If the royal family still directly owned Royal Lodge, Andrew might still be there. One of the most contentious aspects of the Royal Lodge saga, and one that continues even after Andrew's departure, is the question of security. Prince Andrew, as a member of the royal family, receives publicly funded security from the Metropolitan Police. This isn't a privilege extended to all royals. It's reserved for senior working royals, and those deemed to face credible security threats because of their status, profile, or specific circumstances. The estimated cost of Andrew's security is around £3 million per year. That's an enormous sum of public money being spent to protect a man who no longer performs any official duties, who has been effectively exiled from public royal life, and whose reputation is so damaged that his presence at public events is considered a liability. The justification for continuing his security, according to officials, is that Andrew remains a member of the royal family and therefore a potential target for terrorism, kidnapping, or other threats. His status as the late Queen's son and King Charles's brother makes him symbolically significant, regardless of his personal behavior. But many members of the public and many politicians find this justification insufficient. If Andrew is too disgraced to represent the monarchy publicly, if he's been forced out of his home because he's a financial and reputational burden, then why should taxpayers continue funding his protection? The question became particularly pointed during the Royal Lodge standoff. Andrew was living in a £30 million mansion, refusing to downsize, while taxpayers paid millions to secure that mansion and protect him inside it. The optics were terrible. Some royal commentators and security experts argued that Andrew should be moved to the lower tier of security usually reserved for non-working royals. Essentially, he'd be responsible for funding his own private security, as Prince Harry was required to do after stepping back from royal duties. Others argued that removing security entirely would be irresponsible and potentially dangerous, regardless of Andrew's personal failings. King Charles reportedly agrees that Andrew's security costs are unsustainable and wants to reduce them. But the decision isn't entirely his to make. It involves the Home Office, the Metropolitan Police, and assessments of actual threat levels. As of early 2024, Andrew's security remains in place, but the debate continues. It's another layer of public resentment, another aspect of the Royal Lodge story that highlights the gap between royal privilege and ordinary accountability. It's impossible to fully understand Andrew's situation without considering the role his mother played, both in protecting him and, ultimately, in the timing of his downfall. Queen Elizabeth II had a reputation for being dutiful, reserved, and deeply committed to the monarchy as an institution above personal feelings. But those who knew her well say she was also fiercely protective of her family, and particularly of Andrew. Andrew was, by many accounts, her favorite child. He was born when she was older, more settled in her role, and reportedly able to spend more time with him than she'd been able to spend with Charles and during her early reign. He served in the Falklands War and returned a hero. He was charming, confident, and dutiful in his royal role for many years. When the Epstein scandal broke, Elizabeth stood by him. She funded his legal defense. She allowed him to continue living at Royal Lodge even after he stopped performing royal duties. She included him in family events, even when public opinion turned sharply against him. She was photographed riding with him in Windsor, a deliberate public statement of support. Some saw this as admirable maternal loyalty. Others saw it as enabling behavior that allowed Andrew to avoid full accountability. Either way, Elizabeth's protection meant that Andrew faced limited consequences while she was alive. But in September 2022, Elizabeth died. And within months, everything changed. King Charles, who had reportedly been frustrated with the Andrew situation for years, was finally free to act. He cut Andrew's allowance. He pressured him to leave Royal Lodge. He signaled clearly that Andrew's days of protection were over. Would any of this have happened if Elizabeth had lived another 5 years? It's hard to say. Perhaps public pressure would have forced her hand eventually. Or perhaps Andrew would still be at Royal Lodge, still shielded by his mother's loyalty and her reluctance to cause him pain. Elizabeth's death, then, was a turning point, not just for the monarchy, but specifically for Andrew. Her passing removed his primary protector and left him vulnerable to a brother who had very different priorities and far less patience. King Charles III has been remarkably consistent for decades in his vision for the monarchy's future. Smaller, more efficient, more focused, more accountable. He's long argued that the core working royal family should consist of the monarch, the heir, and a small number of close relatives who actively perform duties. Everyone else, the extended cousins, the non-working royals, the hangers-on, should not receive public funding, should not live in state-funded properties, and should not present themselves as representing the crown. This vision is driven partly by financial pragmatism. The monarchy is expensive, and public tolerance for that expense has limits, and partly by a belief that a smaller institution is more defensible in a democratic age. Charles's approach to Andrew fits perfectly into this strategy. Andrew is not a working royal. He does not perform duties. He is a liability, not an asset. Therefore, he should not live in a crown estate property, should not receive royal funding, and should not be given the privileges associated with active royal status. From Charles's perspective, forcing Andrew out of Royal Lodge isn't personal. It's institutional. It's about creating a clear line. If you don't work, you don't get the perks. But of course, it is personal. Andrew is Charles's brother. They grew up together, served together, shared decades of family history. Forcing Andrew out of his home is not an easy or emotionally neutral decision. Charles has been willing to make it anyway, because he believes the institution is more important than individual comfort. Whether that makes him cold, pragmatic, or simply realistic depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is that the Royal Lodge eviction is a signal. The new reign will be different. The old protections are gone. Status is earned through service, not simply inherited through birth. And if you can't or won't serve, you don't get to keep the palace. Public reaction to Andrew's eviction from Royal Lodge has been overwhelmingly positive, but not universally so, and the nuances are worth examining. The majority of Britons, according to polling, supported the decision to force Andrew out. They saw it as overdue accountability, a necessary step, and evidence that the monarchy was finally taking public opinion seriously. Many saw it specifically through the lens of class and inequality. during a cost of living crisis, with millions of Britons struggling to afford housing, heating, and food. The image of a disgraced prince clinging to a £30 million mansion was intolerable. His eviction felt like a rare moment when the wealthy and powerful were actually held to account. But there were dissenting voices. Some argued that Andrew's treatment was disproportionate, that he'd never been criminally charged, that the allegations against him were never proven in court, and that he'd settled a civil case, which is not an admission of guilt. They saw his public humiliation and forced eviction as trial by media, not justice. Others pointed out the double standards within the royal family. Why was Andrew forced out of Royal Lodge while other non-working royals continued to live in valuable properties? Why was he punished while others with scandals, different scandals, but scandals nonetheless, remained protected? And some, particularly monarchists and traditionalists, worried that the eviction set a dangerous precedent, that subjecting royals to public pressure and media campaigns undermined the stability and dignity of the institution. These were minority opinions, but they reflected real concerns about due process, media power, and the risk of populist pressure overriding legal rights. For most people, though, the Royal Lodge eviction was simple. Andrew behaved badly, failed to face consequences for years, and finally, belatedly, paid a price. It wasn't perfect justice. He wasn't in prison, he wasn't bankrupt, he was moving to a comfortable cottage, not the street, but it was something. And in an age when so much injustice goes unchecked, when the wealthy and powerful so often escape accountability, even symbolic consequences felt meaningful. The Royal Lodge saga is, at its core, a story about class. Britain has a complex, deeply entrenched class system that shapes everything from where people live and how they speak, to what opportunities they have and how they're treated by institutions. And the royal family sits at the very top of that system, the ultimate symbol of inherited privilege. For centuries, that position was largely unquestioned. Kings and queens ruled by divine right. Aristocrats owned land, titles, and power simply by virtue of birth. The idea that some people were born to lead and others born to follow was baked into the social structure. But over the past century, that system has been slowly dismantled, legally, socially, and culturally. The political power of the monarchy has been reduced to almost nothing. The House of Lords has been partially reformed. Aristocratic estates have been broken up, sold off, or open to tourists. Deference has collapsed. People no longer automatically respect titles, wealth, or royal status. And yet, the privileges remain. Royals and aristocrats still live in grand houses, still inherit enormous wealth, still move in exclusive circles. They're still protected, to a degree, from the consequences ordinary people would face for the same behavior. Andrew's situation threw all of this into sharp relief. Here was a man born into extraordinary privilege, literally born a prince, given titles, property, and opportunities that 99.9% of humanity could never dream of. And he'd squandered it. He'd associated with a predator. He'd shown appalling judgment. He'd damaged the institution he was supposed to represent. And yet, for years, he'd continued to live in luxury, shielded by family connections and institutional protections. For many Britons, especially those struggling economically, Andrew represented everything wrong with the class system. Unearned privilege, lack of accountability, and a sense that some people simply play by different rules. His eviction from Royal Lodge, then, was more than just one man losing a house. It was a symbolic victory for the idea that privilege has limits, that even princes can be held accountable, and that the old class hierarchies are, however slowly, breaking down. The Royal Lodge story wasn't just a British scandal, it was international news, covered extensively in the US, Canada, Australia, and across Europe. But the international reaction was notably different from the British reaction, in ways that revealed differing attitudes toward monarchy and privilege. In the United States, where there's no monarchy and a cultural emphasis on meritocracy and equality, the response was often more harshly critical. American media outlets covered Andrew's Newsnight interview with something close to shock. The tone deafness, the lack of empathy, the bizarre defenses all seemed to confirm American stereotypes about out-of-touch royalty. The fact that Andrew was allowed to remain at Royal Lodge for years after the scandal broke was seen as evidence of systemic corruption and privilege run amok. When he was finally evicted, American commentators treated it as overdue but insufficient. Why wasn't he facing criminal charges? Why was he still receiving security funding? Why was he moving to another comfortable property rather than facing real consequences? In Commonwealth countries like Canada and Australia, where the British monarch is still the head of state, the reaction was more conflicted. There's a mix of residual affection for the royal family and growing Republican sentiment, a sense that the monarchy is outdated, irrelevant, and increasingly difficult to justify. Andrew's scandal fed directly into Republican arguments. If this is what royalty produces, entitled, unaccountable, morally compromised individuals living in luxury on public funds, then why maintain the institution at all? In Europe, particularly in countries with their own monarchies, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the coverage was more measured. European royals have faced their own scandals, and there's a general understanding that modern monarchies survive only by adapting, holding their members accountable, and maintaining public trust. King Charles's decision to force Andrew out was seen in European royal circles as necessary damage control, exactly the kind of decisive action required to protect the institution. But there was also sympathy in some quarters for the human cost. One dethroned prince, humiliated publicly, losing his home. It was a reminder of how precarious royal life can be, how quickly status can evaporate, and how brutally the public can turn. There's a dimension to this story that often gets overshadowed by discussions of royal protocol and property leases. The experiences of Jeffrey Epstein's victims and what Andrew's treatment, or lack thereof, says about how society handles sexual violence. Virginia Giuffre and dozens of other women have described being trafficked, manipulated, and abused by Epstein and his network. They were teenagers. They were vulnerable. They were exploited by wealthy, powerful men who believed their money and connections made them untouchable. And for years, they were right. Epstein operated openly for decades. Rumors about his behavior circulated for years before any legal action was taken. When he was finally arrested in 2008, he received an astonishingly lenient sentence through a controversial plea deal that has since been widely condemned as a miscarriage of justice. Prince Andrew's role in this system is disputed. He denies the allegations, and he's never been criminally charged. But even if you set aside the specific allegations against him, his continued friendship with Epstein after the 2008 conviction is indefensible. He chose to associate with a convicted sex offender. He stayed at Epstein's home. He was photographed walking with him in public. And when confronted about it, his explanation was that the friendship had been useful. From a feminist perspective, this is a clear example of how power structures protect abusers and sideline victims. Epstein's victims spent years seeking justice, fighting to be believed, trying to hold powerful men accountable. And one of those men was a British prince who had the resources, legal teams, and institutional support to avoid serious consequences. Andrew eventually settled Giuffre's civil case, but he did so without admitting liability, and the terms were confidential. He paid money, but he avoided testimony, avoided trial, and avoided the kind of public reckoning that might have forced a deeper examination of his actions. The eviction from Royal Lodge in this context is symbolic but inadequate. It's a loss of status and comfort, not accountability for harm. Andrew is living in a cottage, not facing criminal prosecution. He's lost his mansion, not his freedom or his wealth. For Epstein's victims, the outcome must feel deeply unsatisfying. One of the men they accused has been publicly humiliated and financially strained, but he's not in jail, he's not stripped of his titles, and he's not truly being held accountable for the allegations against him. The Royal Lodge story, then, is not just about monarchy or privilege. It's about how societies handle sexual violence, who gets believed, and who gets protected. Prince Andrew is still alive, still living at Frogmore Cottage, still a member of the royal family. But his public life is effectively over, and it's not too early to ask, what will his legacy be? For someone born into such extraordinary privilege, with so many opportunities and resources? The answer is tragic. Andrew's legacy will not be his military service. Though he served honorably in the Falklands War as a Royal Navy helicopter pilot. It will not be his years of diplomatic work as a trade envoy, though he carried out thousands of engagements and met with business leaders across the world. It will not be his role as a father or his charitable patronages, or the renovations he funded at Royal Lodge. It will be the Epstein scandal, that association, and the disastrous Newsnight interview that attempted to defend it, will define how history remembers him. This is partly Andrew's own doing. He made the choices that led to the scandal, choosing Epstein's friendship, maintaining it after the conviction, agreeing to the interview, refusing to show empathy or understanding during the interview. Those were active decisions, not accidents or misfortunes. But it's also a function of how scandals work in the modern media age. Once a narrative solidifies, it's almost impossible to change. Andrew is now permanently the disgraced prince, the prince and the pervert, the royal who refused to sweat. Future historians will write about him as a cautionary tale, a case study in privilege misused, judgment failed, and reputation destroyed. Royal Lodge will be a footnote in that story. The mansion he clung to long after he should have left, the final symbol of his refusal to accept accountability, and the place he was finally forced out of when the monarchy decided enough was enough. It's a deeply sad legacy for someone who once had so much potential, so many advantages, and so many opportunities to make different choices. Prince Andrew's fall and his eviction from Royal Lodge have consequences that extend far beyond one man and one property. They've fundamentally changed how the British monarchy operates and how the public perceives it. First, they've accelerated the shift toward a smaller, more accountable institution. King Charles's vision of a slimmed-down monarchy, only working royals receiving public support and living in state properties, is now being implemented with unprecedented speed. Andrew's eviction was the clearest signal, yet that the old model, where large numbers of extended royal family members enjoyed privileges by birth, is over. This is partly financial pragmatism. The monarchy is expensive, and in an age of austerity and economic pressure, public tolerance for funding a large royal apparatus has collapsed. But it's also about public trust. People are more willing to accept a monarchy if it's clearly focused on public service, not personal luxury. Second, Andrew's scandal has forced the monarchy to demonstrate accountability in ways it historically resisted. For centuries, the royal family's instinct was to close ranks, protect its members, and avoid public criticism. Scandals were handled privately. Disciplinary actions, if any, happened behind closed doors. The family maintained a united front. That approach doesn't work anymore, and the Andrew case proved it decisively. The palace tried to protect Andrew initially, issuing statements, minimizing the scandal, keeping him in royal life. But public pressure, media scrutiny, and the sheer weight of the evidence made that position untenable. King Charles's decision to force Andrew out of Royal Lodge was a public acknowledgement that the old protections are gone. Royals who behave badly will face consequences. The institution will prioritize its reputation and public trust over protecting individual members. This is a significant, perhaps historic, shift. Third, the scandal has intensified debates about whether the monarchy should exist at all. Republican sentiment, the belief that Britain should abolish the monarchy and become a full republic, has been growing for years, particularly among younger generations. Andrew's behavior and the years it took to hold him accountable have given Republicans powerful ammunition. If the monarchy produces people like Andrew, if it took a public outcry to force consequences, if he's still living comfortably in a crown estate property after everything, then what's the point of the institution? Charles's supporters argue that his handling of Andrew shows the monarchy can reform, can adapt, and can hold itself to modern standards. Critics argue that the fact it took this long and required this much public pressure shows the institution is fundamentally flawed. The Royal Lodge eviction won't settle that debate, but it's become a key piece of evidence in it. There's one more dimension to this story worth considering, one that has nothing to do with scandal or privilege. The question of what happens to historic houses when their human stories become too toxic to bear. Royal Lodge is a beautiful building. It has genuine architectural significance, designed by one of the most important architects of the Georgian era. It has historical importance, having housed kings and queens, and having been the cherished home of the Queen Mother for half a century. It's filled with art, furniture, and objects that tell stories about British history, royal life, and changing tastes over centuries. But now it's tainted. Andrew's tenure there and the scandal that surrounded it have fundamentally changed what Royal Lodge represents. It's no longer just a beautiful historic house. It's the place where a disgraced prince hid from accountability. It's the mansion he refused to leave. It's a symbol of entitlement and denial. That symbolic weight makes the building's future complicated. If Royal Lodge is open to the public as a museum or historic house, how do you tell its story? Do you focus on the Queen, Mother's decades there, emphasizing the happier history and downplaying Andrew's time? Do you address the scandal directly, treating it as part of the building's layered history? Do you avoid mentioning Andrew at all and risk accusations of whitewashing? There's no easy answer. This is a problem that historic houses face whenever their human stories become controversial. Do you tell the full truth, including the ugly parts? Or do you curate a more comfortable narrative that preserves the building's reputation but erases complexity? Royal Lodge's future curators will have to make those choices. And whatever they decide, Andrew's shadow will remain. For the rest of the royal family, the Royal Lodge saga is a lesson and a warning. The lesson is simple. The old rules are gone. Birth no longer guarantees protection. Royal status no longer shields you from accountability. If you behave badly, if you damage the institution, if you become a liability, you will face consequences. This applies most directly to the working royals. William and Catherine, Edward and Sophie, Anne. They've seen what happened to Andrew, and they understand that their positions are conditional on continued good behavior and public service. They can't coast on titles or status. But it also applies to the younger generation, George, Charlotte, Louis, and the children of other royals who may someday have public roles. They're growing up in a monarchy that demands more, forgives less, and operates under constant public scrutiny. For some royals, this new reality is probably liberating. If you want to leave royal life, pursue private careers, and live without the burden of public duty, like Harry and Meghan did, you're now free to do so. The expectation that you'll remain in the institution simply because of your birth has weakened. But for those who choose to stay, the expectations are higher than ever. You must work. You must behave with impeccable moral judgment. You must understand that every friendship, every financial decision, every public appearance will be scrutinized. And if you fail, if you become a scandal, a liability, a problem, the institution will not save you. Andrew's fall is the proof. There's a photograph taken in the early 2000s that captures something important about Royal Lodge before everything fell apart. It shows the Queen Mother's 100th birthday celebration, held in the gardens of Royal Lodge. She's seated in the center, surrounded by her family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all smiling, all together. The sun is shining. The gardens are in full bloom. It's a perfect moment, frozen in time. Andrew is in that photograph. So are Charles, William, Harry, and all the others. They're a family celebrating a matriarch, gathered in a house that represented continuity, history, and the best version of royal life. That version of Royal Lodge is gone now. The Queen Mother has been dead for over 20 years. The Queen herself is gone. The family that gathered in those gardens has fractured. Harry and Meghan in California, Andrew disgraced, the institution itself under constant scrutiny and pressure. And Royal Lodge, the house that once symbolized family and tradition, now stands empty, waiting for someone to decide what it should become next. In many ways, Royal Lodge's story is a microcosm of the monarchy's larger story in the 21st century. Beautiful, historic, meaningful, but burdened by scandals, financial pressures, and the constant question of relevance. The house survived its most recent occupant. Whether the institution will survive its current challenges remains an open question. But one thing is certain. The age of unchallenged royal privilege, the age when birth alone guaranteed a palace and protection, is over. And Royal Lodge, empty, quiet, and waiting, is the proof. We started this story standing outside Royal Lodge on a cold January evening in 2024, watching Prince Andrew pack up and leave. Now, after tracing the full arc of the house's history, from its origins as a modest keeper's lodge, through its transformation under George IV, its golden age with the Queen Mother, and its final toxic chapter with Andrew, we can see the full picture. Royal Lodge is more than a building. It's a mirror. It reflects the best and worst of monarchy, of privilege, of power. It shows us what happens when family loyalty conflicts with public accountability. It shows us how institutions protect their own until they can't anymore. It shows us the human cost of living inside a system that values status over character and heritage over justice. For the Queen Mother, Royal Lodge was a sanctuary, a place where royalty could, for a moment, feel almost normal. A place where gardens mattered more than protocol, where family gathered, where life was lived with grace and warmth. For Prince Andrew, Royal Lodge became a prison of his own making, a symbol of his refusal to accept reality, his inability to understand that the world had changed, and his desperate clinging to a status he no longer deserved. The house itself is innocent, of course. It's just bricks and mortar, windows and walls, gardens and gates. But the stories that play out inside houses shape how we see them, and Andrew's story has permanently altered how Royal Lodge will be remembered. The dark truth at the heart of this story is not complicated. Privilege without accountability is corrosive. It corrodes the people who hold it, the institutions that grant it, and the societies that tolerate it. Andrew was born into extraordinary privilege. He was given opportunities, resources, and protections that most people could never imagine. And he used that privilege to associate with a predator, to avoid consequences, and to live in luxury long after his behavior should have disqualified him from it. The system protected him for years. His mother protected him. His status protected him. His wealth and connections protected him. Until finally they didn't. The eviction from Royal Lodge is not perfect justice. Andrew is not in prison. He's not destitute. He's not stripped of his title or his place in the line of succession. He's living in a comfortable cottage with his ex-wife, still receiving some financial support, still a prince. But something fundamental has changed. He's been held accountable publicly, symbolically, in a way that would have been unthinkable for a royal even 20 years ago. He's lost his status, his home, his reputation, and his future. He's become a warning to every other royal, a reminder that birth alone is not enough anymore. And Royal Lodge, beautiful, historic, empty, stands as a monument to that change. The Royal Lodge story matters beyond Britain, beyond monarchy, beyond royalty. It matters because it's about power, who has it, how they use it, and what happens when they abuse it. It matters because it's about accountability, whether societies can hold their most privileged members to the same standards as everyone else, or whether wealth and status create permanent immunity. It matters because it's about institutions, whether they can reform themselves, whether they can prioritize principles over individuals, and whether they can survive in a world that increasingly demands transparency and justice. These are questions every society faces. In democracies, we ask whether political leaders face real consequences for corruption or wrongdoing, or whether they're shielded by party loyalty, legal technicalities, and institutional protection. In corporations, we ask whether executives who cause harm face accountability, or whether they walk away with golden parachutes and untarnished reputations. In social hierarchies of all kinds, wealth, fame, power, we ask whether the rules apply equally, or whether some people simply play a different game. Royal Lodge is one story, one house, one disgraced prince. But it's also a test case for the broader question. Can we, as societies, actually enforce accountability on the powerful? The answer, in this case, is complicated. Andrew faced consequences, but they were delayed, partial, and symbolic rather than legal. He lost his home and his status, but not his freedom or his wealth. He was held accountable by his family and public opinion, but not by the criminal justice system. Is that enough? For some people, yes, it's a meaningful shift, a sign that privilege has limits, and a victory for public pressure and institutional reform. For others, no, it's insufficient, a reminder that the wealthy and powerful still escape real consequences, and proof that the system is still rigged in their favor. Both perspectives are valid. What's undeniable is that the Royal Lodge saga has changed something. It's set a precedent. It's shown that even royals can fall, that even palaces can be taken away, and that even the most protected individuals have breaking points. Whether that change is enough, whether it goes far enough, whether it signals deeper reform or just surface-level optics, those are questions we'll only be able to answer with time. Royal Lodge sits empty now, quiet behind its gates, waiting. The gardens are still maintained. The exterior is still painted. The roof is still repaired. The Crown Estate has taken back full control, and the property is being kept in good condition while decisions are made about its future. But it's strange, walking past those gates now, knowing the house is empty, knowing that the rooms where the Queen Mother laughed with friends, where Andrew desperately clung to status, where princesses grew up and families gathered, those rooms are silent. Houses have a way of holding onto their stories. The walls remember the conversations. The floors remember the footsteps. The windows remember the light and the seasons and the people who looked out of them. Royal Lodge remembers everything. The glory and the scandal, the love and the denial, the beauty and the darkness. And now it waits to see what comes next. Will another royal move in, attempting to reclaim the house's dignity and restore its reputation? Will it be open to the public, its history carefully curated to emphasize the Queen Mother and downplay Andrew? Will it be repurposed for state functions, turning a home into a venue? Or will it remain empty for years, a beautiful, expensive ghost, too valuable to abandon, but too tainted to easily repurpose? We don't know yet. But whatever happens, Royal Lodge will always carry the weight of this story. It will always be the mansion where a prince refused to leave, where privilege met accountability, and where the monarchy finally, belatedly, chose institutional survival over individual protection. It will always be a reminder that even the most beautiful houses can tell dark stories, and that sometimes the most important lesson a palace can teach us is that no one, no matter how royal, how wealthy, how protected, is truly above the rules. The gates are closed, the lights are off, the house waits, and the story, for now, is over.